Welcome to this episode of the VO2 Lounge podcast. In this special episode, I'll be going into the physiology of Tour de France, Vuelta a España, Giro d'Italia, generally the physiology of World Tour and Grand Tour champions. If you're new to this podcast, then welcome, and I hope you enjoy. If you're a return member of the podcast, then why not follow if you haven't already, and leave a rating on your pod platform of choice. Now, the catalyst for today's episode was during the Tour de France, and it was the remarkable performance of Tadej Pogačar and Jonas Vingegaard, but more was the fact that the values put forward by the internet and people in general about Tadej Pogačar scaling the Puy de Dôme with a sustained power output of 7 watts per kilo during a 14-minute and 50-second climb after already maintaining 6.2 watts per kilo for 20 minutes and 21 seconds, totaling 6.5 watts per kilo for over 35 minutes. It's an extraordinary achievement, and regardless of anything people really think about how clean the sport is, regardless, it is staggering, the performance. So even accounting for Pogačar's reported weight of 66 kilos compared to the hypothetical 60 kilograms used for a lot of the estimates, the numbers remain incredible, sustaining 420 watts for almost 15 minutes, following a 372 watt effort for over 20 minutes. And all of this after hours of prior cycling, and demands an immense amount of respect, really. So, the physiology of champions. The basics would suggest that for endurance sports, 3 main factors are crucial. That is maximal oxygen consumption, also known as VO2MAX, lactate threshold, and efficiency, which is effectively, the oxygen cost to generate a given running speed or cycling power output. Now, these play key roles in endurance performance as a whole. VO2max and lactate threshold interact to determine the performance in a way of the athlete. VO2max, which is the oxygen consumption that can be sustained for a given period of time, and efficiency interacts with VO2max to establish the speed or power that can be generated at this given oxygen consumption. So they all come in hand. Not one of these can be suboptimal or sub-elite with these athletes at this end of the spectrum. So starting with lactate threshold, in untrained and low-level trained athletes, there's typically no sustained rise in blood lactate concentration until about 60% of their VO2 max. In trained subjects and elite athletes, this value increases to between 75 and 95% of their VO2 max, which is incredibly important because not only do you need the high ceiling, but with your lactate threshold appearing at closer to VO2 max, the greater glycogen sparing capacity you essentially now possess and can remain in the terms of cycling with a group or running with the lead pack without digging into those glycogen stores. So, what happens as we reach lactate threshold is the maximum rate of fat oxidation is inadequate to meet the ATP demands of the muscles contracting at moderate to high intensities. This then causes intracellular signaling events to occur which stimulate glyconeogenesis and glycolysis, and ultimately the rate of pyruvate delivery to the mitochondria progressively exceeds the ability of the mitochondria to oxidize pyruvate, and this then leads to the accelerated generation of lactate in the blood. By the way, pyruvate is also present when glucose is being used as a fuel at any point, but this threshold effectively is is signifying the point at which your physiology is no longer capable of keeping that reaction localized to the muscle. And the associated hydrogen ions is then a likely culprit of muscle fatigue, and is often where you kind of hear lactic acid. It's really these hydrogen ions that are causing this pH shift and possibly the fatigue of the muscle. So while the physiological detriments of the lactate threshold are extremely complex, they are determined mainly by the oxidative capacity of the skeletal muscle themselves. This capacity is highly plastic and can essentially increase more than twofold in trained skeletal muscles of humans or animals who engage in 20 to 120 minutes of training at a required level of intensity, effectively the intervals. This more than doubling of the oxidative capacity is one of the factors that is linked to the high lactate threshold values seen in elite endurance athletes. These elite athletes have VO2MAX values that are 50 to, in some cases, 100% above those seen in normal, active and sedentary young people, and their lactate threshold occurs at an even higher percentage of their VO2MAX. This means that that elite athletes, the absolute oxygen consumption, power output or speed, that can be generated for long periods of time before reaching the lactate threshold is essentially doubled, allowing sustained running speeds of 20 kilometers an hour, or in the case of cycling where we're focusing, power outputs of over or around 400 watts, going back to the initial statement about Tadej Pogačar at the Tour. And other key factors that reduce muscle fatigability and lactate production during exercise at these high percentages of VO2 max, when only a fraction of the total limb muscle mass is simultaneously recruited, is the quantity of muscle mass that an athlete can recruit to share in sustained power production. Now, elite cyclists have been shown to be capable of sharing power production through 20 to 25% more muscle mass throughout a 1 hour bout of cycling, therefore reducing the relative power production and stress on each individual fiber. Additionally, this power sharing among fibers would also reduce the glycolytic stress and lactate production per fiber due to more total mitochondrial sharing for a given rate of aerobic metabolism. And these factors should operate in a complementary way that reduces the stress per mitochondria and muscle fiber. Now, this is obviously crucial effectively because if you're carrying, first of all, cycling being a very power to weight ratio sensitive sport, if you are carrying any mass, particularly useful mass, in the sense of favorable muscles like quads, calves, glutes, and there are fibers in there not being utilized to output a given amount of power, then being able to recruit all of these is obviously critical. As exercise extends beyond approximately the 2 hour mark, the problem becomes one of fuel availability. The glycogen content in skeletal muscle becomes depleted, and the modest ability of active muscles to take up glucose from the blood via either the liver or from feeding can limit the rate of oxidative ATP generation, and thus the pace that can be sustained during that bout of exercise. In some, but not all subjects, the associated reduction in blood glucose evokes a frank symptoms of hypoglycemia that limit the ability of individuals to continue exercising. Dizziness, inability to contract muscle really. Anyone who's done any form of endurance exercise will be familiar with hitting the wall or bonking or whatever terminology you're used to. Other highly trained subjects show remarkable resistance to hypoglycemia, and for these athletes, muscle glycogen depletion is probably more important. In response to these events, a number of pre-competition dietary strategies, enduring exercise energy replacement regimes, and products have been developed. When these are used in optimal manner, muscle glycogen stores can be augmented by 40% before exercise, and hypoglycemia can be avoided, with the net effect of being that the duration of exercise at about the lactate threshold can be extended by approximately 1/3, so from 2 to 3 to 4 hours. So obviously you've got two modalities there. You've got carb loading, which is often something between 9 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram, and that is grams of carbohydrate. So for example, say you're taking pasta, that isn't 9 to 12 grams of pasta. That is then, if 85% of that pasta is carbohydrate, is the raw carbohydrate value. And then the replenishment during exercise is things simply like gels and carbohydrates in the bottles, which also again is part of their training, ensuring that they can consume such high amounts of food and nutrition during, pre and post race. At this point, it's worth going back a step to the point before lactate threshold and talking about zone 2 in the elite cyclist's incredible fat oxidative capacity. A high fat oxidative capacity is a crucial physiological trait for elite cyclists and endurance athletes in general, due to its direct impact on their performance during prolonged and demanding aerobic activities like long distance races, which really any road racing is considered to long distance really. This concept is closely related to the body's ability to efficiently utilize fat as a source of energy during exercise, especially at lower to moderate intensities. Here's why a high fat oxidative capacity is so important for elite cyclists. So, energy efficiency. Fat is a dense energy source, providing more energy per gram than carbohydrates. This becomes especially relevant during extended endurance activities where the body's carbohydrate stores, glycogen, can become depleted. At a high fat oxidative capacity allows athletes to rely more on fat metabolism, sparing precious glucose stores and delaying the onset of fatigue, especially for those short bouts of ultra high intensity where selections may be made getting into the breakaway or a mountaintop finish, for example. As stated already, the extended endurance capabilities, elite cyclists often participate in races that last several hours, even days in some cases, such as the Vuelta. The ability of efficiently burn fats helps sustain energy levels over these extended periods and over multiple days, and allows them to stay in these races. The reduced reliance on carbohydrates, although they are a quick and efficient energy source, the body's capacity to store them is incredibly limited in comparison to a lipid. Once glycogen stores are depleted, athletes can experience a sudden drop in energy levels, known as hitting the wall or bonking in cycling. A high fat oxidative capacity delays this carbohydrate depletion, allowing cyclists to perform at a higher level for a longer duration. Now, from that, there are also adaptations to training where elite cyclists often engage in high volume training to build endurance. This type of training can promote the body's adaptation to utilize fat as a primary energy source, enhancing the fat oxidative capacity. Now, this adaptation improves the efficiency of energy utilization during races, and this is why the lower intensity stuff is so critical, because high intensity work is primarily there to improve glucose use and uptake, and whereas this low level intensity stuff is where they enable themselves to perform over these extremely long multi-day races and single day events, because 6 hour races, there isn't the ability to rely solely on glucose for this. Part of what makes all of this possible is the high capillary density that elite athletes possess. The rate of total ATP turnover during endurance performance reflects the interplay of aerobic and anaerobic metabolisms, with lactate generation serving to maintain NAD plus needed for continued glycolysis and generation of pyruvate, essentially fueling that effort. An example of this interplay is the influence of high skeletal muscles capillary density serving to remove or recycle within muscle fatiguing metabolites, for example, hydrogen ions. In general, elite athletes possess an unusually high muscle capillary density, which may have allowed their exercise and muscles to better tolerate anaerobic metabolism and lactic acid production, or lactate production. But much remains in general to be learned about subtle factors that delay or accelerate fatigue during events performed at intensities above 80 to 90% of VO2MAX. Small increases in total energy expenditure or reductions in oxygen delivery will have disproportionate effects and accelerate fatigue during extremely high intensity exercise. And this, at this time, it remains a bit unclear if laboratory tests can detect subtle adaptations in the very best performers, who seem to be able to manage their metabolism in a way that permits maximum efficient energy utilization through this capillary network and mitochondria and so on and so forth. Moving on to the next pillar of all of this is efficiency. So gross mechanical efficiency when endurance trained cyclists generate 300 watts can vary from about 18.5 to 23.5%, and it appears that more than one half of this variability is related to the percentage of type 1 or slow twitch muscle fibers. The efficiency with which the chemical energy of ATP is converted to physical work depends greatly on the velocity of the sarcomere and the muscle fiber shortening. So type 1 type 1 fibers display greater mechanical efficiency when cycling at cadences of approximately 60 to 120 RPM. Therefore, it's not really a surprise that elite endurance cyclists typically possess a higher percentage of type 1 muscle fibers, given that they are more efficient at performing this task than really anyone else in the world. Although type 1 muscle fibers in untrained humans possess higher mitochondrial density compared with type 2 fibers, which are your fast twitch fibers, it is important to note that with intense interval training, mitochondrial activity can be increased to equally high levels in both fiber types. Thus, with intense endurance training over years, the main functional advantage of type 1 fibers appears to be the efficiency when cycling, rather than the total oxidative capacity of the given fibers, although type 1 fibers seem to retain a greater ability to oxidize fat. It is also of note that many elite cyclists choose to pedal cadences of around 90 RPM. This is a cadence that may actually increase whole body oxygen consumption slightly for a given total body power output from the minimum, which is usually occurs about 50 to 60 RPM. But this is likely to do with an element of one, muscle sparing, and also an element of force production. Obviously, to get the same power output at a lower cadence, the axial force generation at the muscle is going to have to be greater. And as we start getting higher and higher, and obviously these individuals get smaller and smaller in reality, a higher cadence is likely needed to sustain the same power output for a lower torque at the pedal. And for the final piece of all this, VO2MAX. VO2MAX, or maximum oxygen consumption, is a measure of an individual's capacity to take in, transport, and utilize oxygen during intense exercise. It's often considered one of the most important indicators of an athlete's cardiovascular fitness and aerobic endurance. So VO2MAX is usually expressed in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute, so mil per kg per min, which allows for comparison across different individuals regardless of their body size. You will know that as relative VO2max, and absolute would be liters per minute, which obviously there is no weight or mass component. So two people of the same relative VO2max, one of them, if heavier, will have a greater absolute value versus the lighter individual. So in the context of endurance sports like cycling and running, a high VO2max is generally associated with better performance. Athletes with higher VO2max values have a greater ability to deliver oxygen to their muscles, which is essential for energy production during prolonged aerobic activities. Now, it's not the be-all and end-all in the sense that if someone's got a VO2max of 81 and someone else has one of 84, that isn't going to mean that the one with 84 always wins. But if you've got a VO2max of 40, you're not going to be on the Grand Tour. So for elite endurance athletes, having a high VO2max is a critical factor. It reflects their body's ability to transport and utilize oxygen efficiently, allowing them to sustain higher workloads and exercise intensities for longer durations. An athlete's VO2max is influenced by genetic factors, training adaptations, and specific physiological characteristics. A VO2max of 80 ml per kg per min, as mentioned, is considered world class for both cycling and running. This level indicates exceptional cardiovascular fitness and is often found in elite athletes who specialize in endurance events. Such high values suggest that these athletes can deliver a substantial amount of oxygen to their muscles, allowing them to perform at high intensities. Now, these values are reserved pretty much to cyclists, runners, triathletes, and maybe rowers. You won't really find VO2maxes of this magnitude in even team sports such as football, where obviously fitness is and cardiovascular capacity is important, but it is not the sole determining factor to some extent. It's not what you're really selecting for. While having a high VO2max is obviously, as already mentioned, critical, it's not the only factor that determines performance in events like in any real cycling events that are over, let's even just say 5 minutes. Where, in things like the Vuelta and the Tour and the Giro, stages can last for several hours and they happen day after day. Another critical aspect is the percentage of an athlete's VO2max that can be sustained over prolonged periods of time. This is often referred to as their submaximal or steady state endurance capacity. Now, sustaining a high percentage of VO2max for extended periods is essential for endurance events because it reflects the athlete's ability to maintain a high work rate while not exhausting their energy reserves too quickly. And it's about finding a balance between intensity and sustainability that is required here. So elite endurance athletes train to improve their submaximal endurance capacity, as this is what allows them to perform consistently during long events. This brings us to the end of this episode. For more content like this, explore previous episodes and consider following, rating and sharing the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Share your thoughts and suggest future topics at the VO2lounge@gmail.com. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it's goodbye.